I was an explorer once. Captain Sam Stone of the Surveyor. It was good. Hell, it was awesome. The truth is, they don't care about who we used to be or what we wanted to do. But if they thought this was gonna be easy, they came to the wrong fucking planet. War!
Hello there, welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga. It's Thursday, the 16th of July. My name is still Alex Hochuli. Alpha Bunga Bunga is myself, George Hoare, and Philip Cunliffe. And this episode is produced by George Hoare, who's going to speak in just a minute, because what we're talking about today is gaming, a subject I know practically nothing about. But George does. George knows a little bit more about gaming.
Well, I'm not sure any of us could realistically describe ourselves as gamers.
No, you play games, George, like all the time.
I have,
particularly in lockdown. In fact, you've talked about it like you've actually hung up on me in order to play a game online with your friends, because that's the way you interact socially.
No, I have a ludic spirit. I have a I have to say during lockdown, I think it has been one of the few means of sociality left. Played Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, and it's actually extremely fun.
So geeky, so geeky.
Yeah, but I don't. I say it's now almost geeky to say that it's geeky, or it's not cool to say that it's not cool. And I guess I've probably had the most games consoles out of all of us over the course of my life. So yeah, but I think we should all be able to ask questions about this important part of popular culture, right? We all know what games are, both board games as well as computer games. So yeah, I think it should be a good discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really spoken about this form of, I don't even know what you're meant to call it. Is it a form of media, a form of storytelling? Is it a type of play that you put? I mean, I guess we'll discuss all of this.
I guess that's why we're getting Jonas on.
Yeah, and so we're going to be talking to Jonas Kyratzes in just a moment about this, and also about Greek politics, because obviously they go so well together. No, we're going to take an opportunity to have a little bit of a chat in the latter bit of this episode about what happened with Syriza, about Greek politics, about what next with the Greek left, because we've discussed these matters sometimes online with Jonas, and take the opportunity to do it, on a podcast. But yeah, I mean, just on gaming, I think, at least on my part, I just want to come clear that I have strong prejudices against gaming and gamers. I just think it's a waste of time. It'd be personally a time suck. And I don't play games because I'm scared that if I were to buy a console, I'd never read a book again. I'd get really drawn in. I would just, smoke weed, eat pizza, and play games the whole time. Those are my prejudices. I think it's better to come clear about these things.
Don't you do that already, but just watch football instead? That seems to be essentially all that you've done for the last few weeks since they started doing football again.
Yeah,
we had to reschedule our discussions and meetings around football. So
I wasn't going to say that, but isn't football also a game? Whoa! So
mind blown moment there.
No, I think it's yeah. I think we should.
This is a good moment for me to say I am not into. It's been a very long time since I've played any video games. I get the last time would have been during high school, I guess, or maybe the first couple of years of university. And I hate football. In fact, I absolutely loathe football. So I'm morally superior to both of you. You see.
All three of us have made ourselves really unpopular, but for quite distinct reasons here. So that's good.
Yeah, we've all alienated distinct constituencies of our listeners. So,
all right, very good.
Yeah, should we get on with the? Should we call Jonas? Jonas, thank you very much for joining us. So yeah, maybe just to kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about the process of game design and development? How does it actually work? Are there any differences to, say, being a writer in the creative process?
Well, so it kind of depends on what you're doing. Like I'm a game writer primarily right now, so I handle the writing side of things. I create narratives and dialogue and all of that sort of thing. I used to also design games. I still occasionally design games, but those are separate if interconnected sort of processes. So writing a game is, well, it's very much like and very much not like writing a novel or writing a screenplay, um, because, well, because it's interactive, but also because it's well, not to be too pretentious, but I think that the kind of narratives we create in games are spatial. They, the difference between a game and a movie is that in a game you can walk into a character's bedroom and check out what books they have, and that's interesting. You can create narrative with all kinds of elements everywhere. So it's not just what the characters are saying, but it's the environment. It's you can create a poster, put it on a wall. Player can look at it. Player may also not look at it. So you need to account for the possibility that they're not going to catch certain things. So it has a much bigger element of world building, but of course also for accounting for different possibilities. A story can go this way, a story can go that way, and it has to interact with all these other elements of production. So, what can we program? What does the gameplay need? That's often, of course, the big issues. Like, well, we want the game to be fun, and the designers had this idea. They're going to do this. Oh, that doesn't fit into the narrative I've created in the slightest. Okay, I'm going to rewrite half the game to make this work for you guys.
So maybe just for our listeners, that some of these very open narratives. What are some of the games that you've worked on, and how does this actually, I guess, work in practice?
Well, okay, so it really depends on the game. That's one of the things about games. It's really not one thing. Games, it's not one. It's kind of one medium, but it's very broad. So you can have incredibly different experiences. I'm working on Syriza 4 currently, which I'm co-writing, with my wife. That one is a fairly linear kind of story with cinematic bits and there you can go off and have some side adventures, but that's fairly similar to a screenplay. But then you have something like the Talos Principle, which is a game about exploration in many ways, where you talk to characters and you make choices. So you okay, I didn't write that part of the game where you make all the choices, but you interact with another character, and that character has opinions and challenges your opinions, and then the choices you make, do I go against this person, do I work with this person, they determine how the rest of the story goes. So obviously we need to account for that. We need to plan how that happens. Now sometimes you have critics who say like, oh, but if anything can happen, then the story isn't really a proper story. What if Romeo doesn't die in Romeo and Juliet? But of course the point is we still control what's going to happen. That's what we do. That's what game writing is. We determine what the paths are that you can take inside a story, and then we try to make all of those versions appealing and interesting in different ways. So one player may have this experience, another player may have that experience. So Talos Principle is very much a game about sort of doubt and faith, and you could play it as somebody who never questions anything, and you're going to get a different experience, a different ending.
I think
than someone who questions anything.
My quite limited understanding of the history of games is that this kind of world building or very open kind of, essentially your choices are much less constrained. So you can actually have almost an entirely different experience of playing a game from somebody else who's playing the same game. This is quite recent. Is that right or not? Has basically increased computing power allowed I guess a wider, more open story?
Not really, because older games used to just use text, pure text, or they used to. Certainly it's something that we maybe do more now than we used to, but I think it's people got interested in that pretty quickly, because it is sort of the inherent appeal of the medium. Is you could do this or you could do that. So immediately people came in who were used to, say, pen and paper role playing, and they wanted that kind of thing too, where you could make a choice and then the story would go in a different way. And so that has always been part of it. But of course, the more sort of space and resources we have, the more we can do it. But it's also a thing that's very hard to do, because the more elaborate a game gets, the harder it is to pull off. So when you had a game that 3 people made or 1 person made, where the differences were in what text was displayed, that didn't cost very much. When you have a game that costs millions of dollars to make, and you have to hire an entire cast of actors to play the parts, and then suddenly you have 2 versions, so you have 10 versions, the cost goes up. Quite a bit.
No, I think it's quite striking these days when you complete a game, particularly quite an open game like Breath of the Wild, and you see the credits roll, and it's much longer than a film, and that's hardly, I guess, surprising, because you have several different discrete journeys you can take through the game, or different experiences you can have. But I mean, maybe just to go back to the Talos Principle, so I guess a question on the philosophical importance of games, or to put it in a slightly pretentious way, maybe what can be done philosophically with games. What do you how do you see this? Because it is quite striking, that particular game. You say it's about doubt and choice, and it seems like a lot of existential considerations come in there. Is this something that you are trying to achieve, I guess essentially a philosophical message in games like that?
Oh, and sorry, just to butt in, if you could also explain to listeners what that game involves, what it's about, for those who are unfamiliar.
Okay, so explaining that game is going to be a bit difficult because it's fairly elaborate. So it's this sort of science fiction story that plays very much with a sort of biblical creation myth, but is about artificial intelligence. And I would have to explain a lot to explain the actual plot, but it's very much sort of, you have kind of a god figure, a devil figure, but it's all within a simulation, and it's all about the survival of the human species via artificial intelligence. It's very much a game about materialism. So the Talos Principle that is a fictional philosophical principle invented by a fictional Greek philosopher that I made up, based on the figure of Talos in Greek mythology, who is a kind of robot who, when he bled out, sort of died. And the idea is that, are humans not very much like that, i.e., you cannot live without your blood, so are you not also a machine? But from there, it kind of goes into this whole complex sort of depiction of trying to become an intelligent being and hovering between faith and doubt. How much faith do I have in sort of the figures of authority around me? It's partially inspired by William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, so it's very much about synthesis between these extremes, of faith and doubt. You need to have faith in humanity. It's a very humanist game, I would say. It's fairly elaborate in the sort of mythological and literary things that it does, and yes, that is something that I certainly am very interested in. Now, I wouldn't say that I'm looking for a philosophical message. I rather dislike where art has gone these days, where things have become very sort of simplified with just like, here's what this is about. It has to say the good moral things or it's bad. It certainly has beliefs behind it. It is, like I said, very humanist, very materialist. I think I don't know if it's the first game to quote Trotsky, but it's certainly one of very few games to quote Trotsky.
Is that would you say, one of the major problems with the games industry today? Not enough quoting of Trotsky?
Definitely, yes.
So,
that's a big problem.
Could we ask what the quote is, or is that giving too much away, Jonas?
Oh, it's this thing. Okay, no, I'm I don't remember it perfectly. It's this thing about being missing a train, and sort of whatever your opinion about reality is, if you miss the train, you've still missed it. Right. So material reality is sort of inescapable, which is sort of one of the recurring themes of that thing, is that no matter what we choose to believe, there is such a thing as an objective reality that we just can't escape. and that's one of the sort of central ideas of the game that it struggles with. That's just true. No matter how pretty the beliefs are that we have, no matter what we tell ourselves, no matter how nice it sounds, that's the baseline. If you don't have blood in your body, you're going to die, no matter what you think about the soul and all of those things. And then where do we go from that? How do we find some sort of meaning?
Good. I think good life advice. Anyway, you do need blood, as far as I know.
Yes.
But just before passing over to Phil for a question, I guess more on on politics and games. Just to hear you kind of describe it the way you were talking about that game, it sounds basically not dissimilar to a kind of a sci-fi novel in the sense of presenting a structure, a narrative, and then the player or the reader goes through it, and it's not, without being didactic, there is certainly a way to present a certain story, which doesn't straightforwardly illustrate concepts or illustrate ideas, but there's certainly a kind of an aspiration to do that.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it does in this case because you're rather directly arguing with another character. The sort of devil figure of the game is someone you interact with via these text terminals. So you are actually kind of arguing back and forth about some philosophical points. So it is trying to sort of jolt you into thinking, but it doesn't necessarily force you into one particular path or into just one interpretation of these events. There has to be a sort of literary width. There has to be space, in my opinion, in art. Art should not just be, here's a bunch of political points. Like even perhaps my most political game that people used to know me before I did Talos. I mean, the thing that I was known for before I did Talos was The Sea Will Claim Everything, which is a game about, well, not about, but very much inspired by the crisis in Europe and Greece and Ireland and all of these things. So it kind of transposes a lot of elements of this economic crisis and the political crisis into this fantastical world. But even though that's a very sort of pro-revolutionary, kind of pro-socialist, game, at the same time, it's not just that, and it's not as simple as that. Like I don't believe in just having a message, because that's not art, right?
Yeah.
Art is how you translate these things through a kind of visionary process. And again, that sounds pretentious, but I mean, how else do you actually talk about art in a way that is meaningful if it's not that? You have to kind of say, okay, it is that. It has this visionary quality where I translate it in a way that I can't really do in any other way. Like it's not an essay. It's not an essay put into digital interactive form.
I think, and that's, my experience of playing the game, that's kind of why it's enjoyable. I think if you were to have a really straightforward philosophical message, it wouldn't be very much fun as a game, because I don't know how exactly you'd get that across. But no, Phil, I think you had.
I just wanted to add something that I don't think that that's the thing about games. Like, it's not about making the game less fun. To me, it's fundamentally about art. Like, whenever I finish writing the novel that I'm writing, or if I work in other media, I still think that reducing it to a sort of just message is didactic and awful. And it can be very political, it can be very philosophical, it can engage deeply with these things. I think several of the games that I've made really do that. They are very much about politics and philosophy. I just think it has to be something richer and more interesting to engage with. And speaking in the language of art, rather than just here's a story about why racism is bad, or here's a story about why capitalism sucks. Those games exist and they're boring as hell.
Yeah, without ambiguity.
Yeah, and I agree with the messages, right? But like, that's not art. That's just a message pasted onto whatever movie or a thing.
Are there games that you would say are philosophically, politically interesting in the more kind of complex way that you suggest at the moment?
Let me think. I'm not a very big fan of most games nowadays. There certainly have been games in the history of games that have engaged with interesting ideas. It feels a bit weird because, of course, I know a lot of the people involved, so I don't want to be too negative about a specific thing or ignore some other thing. But in general, I would say there's definitely games that do interesting things philosophically or politically, but it's always a struggle. It's always a struggle because of just the conditions in which we work, which is true, I think, of any art nowadays, almost any art, especially anything that's like a big production. Like there's just so many constraints that it's not always possible to realize that to the degree that you would like to. I think we have in a couple of games that we've made, and I'm very, very proud of that. And there are other things that I think are very, very interesting, and I'm pretty sure I'm forgetting something very cool right now.
So just to put you on the spot a little bit here, what would you recommend to say one or two?
Someone who's looking for a more
a podcaster, a politics podcaster who's a bit skeptical about some games. I would say is picked up when you talk about interesting games.
I would say even more broadly, Jonas, what would you offer as kind of a start for more complex and interesting, thought-provoking games?
Well, I mean, obviously, I would recommend my own games.
Very good, very good.
like genuinely, I think, without trying to be like horribly arrogant, I've made a couple of things I think are accessible to people who are not really into. Okay, so this is complicated, right? So some of the best gaming experiences are very long, and this is maybe one of the difficulties, that some of the most enjoyable and interesting experiences in games are just, they're like 60 hours of gameplay, and they require a certain familiarity with the medium. Like honestly, without being maybe the most philosophically amazing games, but there's a series of games called Stalker. They're kind of rip-offs of the Tarkovsky movie and the novel Roadside Picnic. And they're all about going into the zone and the sort of the strange environment of that. And what those games manage to evoke as an experience to me is so superb. But they're fucking hard. So for someone who's not really familiar with that, that's not accessible. Yeah. In the same way, there's a game called Far Cry 2. It's actually a very popular series, but the second one of those is a game about a civil war in Africa, in a small African country, and you're sort of a mercenary in that war. And it's an incredibly ugly game. Like, the experience is hideous. Like, as opposed to every other game, like the missions all are like, yeah, go burn that food, go blow up that medicine. And by the end of that experience, you're so sick of the war. And it really does that incredibly well. But, even people who are really into games don't play through that entire game, because it's just such a exhausting experience. So some of the things that I find the most remarkable in sort of what they achieve are very hard to recommend to someone who's not already familiar with the medium. And that's kind of one of our problems, I think. Yeah. To go really deep into the interesting stuff, there's a very famous series of games, the Fallout games. Those are very formative for me. They have 1,000 flaws, right? But they depict this post-apocalyptic world, and the later ones are completely useless to me. But the first couple of them, just it's fascinating to just go into this post-apocalyptic world and interact with the people there and sort of see various stories. And like I said, again, they have 1 million flaws, so maybe they're not the perfect recommendation. But again, it takes this kind of investment and familiarity, which makes games more insular, I suppose. So sorry if I'm drifting off and not talking about the
not at all. I think it's because it ties in. It kind of segues into the question, or the next question that I had, which is if I may be a little self-indulgent, is to do with one of my own projects, and which is to say Lenin Lives, the book that I published in 2017.
Yeah, I have read it.
On the centenary the Russian Revolution, and trying to portray several different scenarios in a way, while also combining it with a particular account of social theory and the classical Marxian tradition. And I suppose one of the struggles I had with writing it was trying to kind of juggle multiple timelines, a fictional timeline of a world in which the Russian Revolution had succeeded in globalizing and had successfully precipitated a tremendous boost to the arc of human progress over the course of the 20th century, alongside a narrative about our actually existing 20th century of all the terrible bloodshed and barbarism that happened over that in that period, and at the same time used kind of intertwining that with a theoretical account of, like I say, Marxian social theory. So anyway, the point being, I suppose, while I was writing it, I kept on feeling that I was coming up against the limits of the book as a form. I mean, the kind of what could be communicated effectively through a book. And I think it was only when I finished it that it occurred to me that perhaps the whole idea, the premise of the notion that the failure of the Russian Revolution has produced a terrible that we live in the post-dystopian world of the failure of the Russian Revolution, and that can be consistently inferred and demonstrated through the history of the 20th century and the 20 years of our own century, and that it seemed to me that perhaps the best kind of format or vehicle for that idea would in fact be a game. And obviously I don't know anything enough about computer games to be able to have a sense of how that could be constructed. But like I say, my frustrations with trying to contain it in the vehicle of a book and the difficulties I had in kind of intertwining those threads made me feel that perhaps there was a different way to communicate those ideas more effectively. And listening to you talk just now about how important the experience of the game is to communicating certain kinds of ideas, such as interacting with people in a post-apocalyptic scenario, brings back brings the idea back to me. So I guess to boil it down to a single question, is could you have a good game about the Russian Revolution, do you think? Is it possible?
So absolutely, I've thought about it a million times. It's something I have considered very, very, very many times myself. It would definitely be possible. You could do it in different ways. So you could do something like an interactive narrative, of course, where you are a character during the Russian Revolution, and the choices you make. You could be a leading figure, Bolshevik, and the choices you make affect how things pan out, which would be the narrative version of doing that, where the strands are very defined, the story strands of where it can go are defined by the designer very clearly. But you could also, if you had a lot of time, write some kind of simulation. You could make a strategy game that is, okay, you just won the Russian Revolution, you're in charge, you're Lenin.
Yeah.
What do you do now? And then just have a strategy game. And of course, that's an interesting aspect of games that gets discussed occasionally, usually in an annoying way, because all leftist discussion of games is generally dreadful. So the parameters of the simulation are what's very political. So games can sometimes have a political dimension that's not clear. So for example, there's a game called Fate of the World, which is about juggling political decisions in order to prevent global warming. And I feel that that's a game that it's got a very elaborate simulation based on a lot of scientific data. But of course, you can't end capitalism in it. In a way, it tells you that it's incredibly hard to ever stop global warming. But that's because it limits you to certain decisions, and it also models decisions in a certain political way. Yeah. And in the same way, this would say a lot about what you see the world like. So, for example, if you introduce more democracy into the Soviet Union, all power to the Soviets, what does that do? Like, does that cause disruption and the bad guys win? Or do you that way actually save the Soviet Union? So, which is, what I would think. But still, that kind of expresses politics in a way that's not just making some kind of obvious statement, but still the constraints of what you created are actually very, very political.
So one of my, I actually ran this by one of my students who's a keen gamer, and he mentioned a add-on or a extra scenario. I don't know exactly the phrase for it, but for Hearts of Iron 4, I think, set in the interwar period in which there's been a spread of the Russian Revolution to the West. And he said the book Lenin Lives reminded him very much of this particular add-on. And so I was very intrigued by this. But I suppose my only concern with that kind of angle is that it would to limit it to the geopolitical aspect of the scenario. So just a strategy game would miss that kind of experiential dimension, which is what I can recall that was one of the elements that I enjoyed the most about games when I was a gamer back in high school. And I've never, and maybe it's just because I've not been gaming for a while, but I don't know if there is a game that successfully combines that experiential kind of world feeling of inhabiting a world with significant kind of consequential and strategic decisions which can be played out, and where you can kind of follow through the consequences of those decisions which affect the course of history.
Yeah, I don't know if there's something like that. There might be, and I'm not thinking of it. Certainly there are games where you make decisions and they have impacts. Sometimes big-ish impacts, but that's, I think, where you run into a resource issue. There's a sci-fi series, the Mass Effect games, that there's three games in a row, and you import your save game from one to the other. And the decisions you make have consequences in the next game and in the game after that, and sometimes fairly big ones. But there's just the problem of how many assets are we going to create in order to depict this? How many it's just the sheer production effort of a lot of variations. Yeah. If you want to have that real experience of being down on the ground and experiencing the consequences of what you've done, rather than have a text pop up that tells you, oh, this is happening, how do you want to react to it? Like that kind of thing you can do. But this kind of really you're in that world as events change thing is just difficult to do. Just purely because we don't have the money or the time. So in a way you can do it, with text, you can do it with simplified graphics. There certainly are games that have allowed a player to have some of that, but there's definitely a real limitation there that's purely a production thing. And it's a shame because I actually find that to be one of the most fascinating elements. I think a couple of games have really sort of tried to engage with it. There's a game called Dragon Age 2. I don't particularly like it, but it's set in one city over a period of time, and the decisions you make kind of affect things. And they really didn't have the resources to do it at all. But still, the concept to me is very appealing, and it's one of the things I personally also really like about games and want to pursue in games. This the experience of history.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wish we could do more of it. I hope we will do more of it. But as always with games, there's just so many constraints.
Jonas, hearing you talk about games made me really want to play them. Made me want to play yours in particular. The Sea Will Claim Everything sounds great, and actually Talos Principle as well. I was saying before we started recording that to these guys, I'm kind of very resistant to gaming, partly because I just see it as a time suck. And in fact, hearing you describe some of these best games, which have the kind of requisite depth, require an investment in time, which all art does. And for that reason, I'm personally reluctant to get to even buy a console because I worried like I'd never read a book again.
Something like Talos, it's great, right? So I'm really proud of that game. People love it. People have had very profound experiences with it. It's also a puzzle game, so you're also going to be solving fairly hard puzzles after a certain point. And there's a shit ton of them. So again, if somebody doesn't like solving puzzles, the narrative experience can just kind of suffer, just be impossible to actually experience. And that's how I ended up making the sequel Claim Everything, which is a game where you literally just click on shit and read stuff. There's nothing else to it. But that's both the wonderful thing. Like if somebody's really into solving puzzles and having this narrative experience, they can have a fantastic experience from it. But if you don't really want to sit around trying to figure out how this laser connects to that laser, then you might not be able to enjoy all that other stuff that's also in there, but the gameplay is still kind of a defining part of the experience. There are games that are more purely, text and decisions and things, and but it's always this balance between those two things, and I think that is both the best thing about the medium, but for someone like you, it could be very off-putting.
Yeah. I mean, this brings me on to something that I wanted to ask about, and I'm trying to formulate the question in my head. But it concerns play and the kind of infinite possibilities of entertainment and diversion that we have in late capitalism. Because I think if you think about kind of like the situationists, for example, wanting to turn the world into play, turn real life and make it more joyous, more spontaneous and creative, and that gaming sort of offers that today. And I guess do we think about gaming specifically as a type of play, or would you prefer to see it in terms of art, as you've said before? But also, how do you?
And just
go on, George.
Just to throw something else in there as well, which is, I guess, the other side of that, which is the gamification of culture, of work, that it seems like we are being implored in various different ways to play games, collect points, all of these kind of, which maybe that's not all there is to computer games or any other sorts of games, of course, but it seems like this there's a cultural imperative. We have to enjoy ourselves both in things that kind of, so that kind of division between games and work is being eroded because work is a game.
And I mean, just to complete my question, because that's really useful what you said, George, is that, I mean, my personal resistance, and this isn't about me, but I just wonder whether other people don't identify with this, is that because there's so much kind of gamification and so much of a draw towards various forms of diversion, that actually I try to make a deliberate effort not to do that, so that I can go and quietly read a book and things like that. So I mean, I just wonder how you position yourself, as a game designer, as a game writer, with regard to these questions.
Well, I mean, our games art is the most tedious discussion that we have non-stop in video games for the last God knows how many years, and it never ends. To me, it's obvious that a lot of what we call games are art. I mean, it's a narrative experience. Somebody wrote it, somebody, acted it, it has an intent. But then the truth is games are not one thing. Tetris is not a narrative experience of that kind. Now, I can admire the genius that it takes to come up with that. And that's definitely amazing. And there are people who make things that are very hard to categorize, that are somewhere between the two, right? And if they call it art, call it art. But of course, I know, to me, it's not necessarily terribly meaningful to no, it's not about whether I'm going to say whether Flappy Bird is art. It's that some things very obviously are. They have, artistic intent, and then other things are just not even the same medium, essentially. They're just a totally different experience with a different everything. So to me, these are essentially, if not separate, very distant from one another. And definitely some games are art, for sure. Many games are art. Some of them are shit art as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be good to be art. The vast majority of games are utter shit, right?
An often
Like-
forgotten
like,
category, like, is it art? Yeah, but I mean, it's still shit. No, I didn't mean to actually ask, in the sense of, is film good or something like that, or is film art, because it would be a stupid question, and to apply that same lens to games would also be stupid, as you rightly elaborate. I guess my concern was more with regard to the question of diversion, and how much, how you see that and how it relates to kind of gamification more broadly. I mean, the way that you describe the games that you worked on very much seems to be, very much an attempt to make art. And, you wouldn't at all categorize that as a kind of one of these kind of, I don't know, one of these attempts at kind of diversion and attention grabbing things that kind of fill our mental space, in a regular day, in which, I think everyone probably tries to make an effort to kind of batten that down and kind of keep a lot of that noise out. And so, I don't know. I guess it's I'm kind of talking myself in
No.
loops here,
I get it. Okay. There's a whole world of things that are just very cynically designed to rot your brain. And I find those hideous. And they have, I think, a connection to gamification. Now, I don't object to something that's purely entertainment. I think we need that in life, just like I need to watch an Indiana Jones movie. And it can have a couple of ideas in it, because otherwise it'll be boring, but it's still not, that deep, but it's entertaining. What I'm working on right now, Syriza, that's fun. There's a couple of ideas in there that are nice and that give it a bit of whatever, but still the main purpose of the thing is to be fun. But I think there's a healthy kind of fun, and then there is this sort of designed to exploit features of your brain kind of fun. The thing that's just like, play another level, give us 3 golden coins to do this. Oh no, your pet will die. Whatever. It's just this sort of brain poison, and that just sucks. And I think that's almost this perverted version of gaming that gets pumped out by capitalism to really exploit people. I mean, you know how a lot of these things, they only survive because some players have impulse control problems, and they call them whales. And that's the people who will pay. You're not going to get 1,000 people to pay $1 to get your stupid in-app purchase. You're going to get one crazy person to buy 1,000, and you're designing your game to find those people who have a problem and exploit them. And that's insane, and that's awful, and I despise that. And I think that's not inherent to the medium, but that's a sort of a perversion of where we are as a society materially. And gamification now is abhorrent. It works really well. And I'm not sure that it really everybody, there are a lot of people in games, at least there were a few years ago, were always talking about gamification and how it's good. And I'm just sort of horrified by it. But I'm not sure that I have any particular insight on it, except that it exploits things about us that are good about human beings in order to make us work more. But then again, I think everything is tending towards that now. I mean, a lot of the woke capitalist stuff is trying to get you to feel good, to feel morally good about what you buy or whatever. It's just because the system itself doesn't run properly anymore. They're now just sort of adding things on top to keep you occupied. And I can see the danger to an individual that you no longer have any space for normal thoughts anymore. We get so flooded with bullshit that it's hard to sit down and read a book sometimes, and or even maybe play a game or watch a movie or do something that's a bit more interesting or complex, because you could also do the really, really dumb thing that but I'm not sure that I
but
have any insight
no.
beyond
I guess
that.
that's interesting, though. Like the idea that games themselves, certainly much more demanding games, both I guess technically as well as imaginationally, to kind of throw yourself into it, really get deeply into the story and everything, that would themselves suffer from what we'd identify as sort of gamification and other various forms of content nausea.
Well, I think that, sorry, just to refer back to something you said earlier about the long experiences of some of those games. I think the ones that have really sort of gripped you, I think that's maybe a more general, pervasive cultural trait, that it's more difficult to read a long book. You read some of these kind of 19th century novels, George Eliot, there's like 200 pages before anything happens. And I think there's something about that need to invest in something, which when you have all of these distractions and all of these quicker games is very is a challenge and is not always easy to achieve. But maybe on a little bit, we've talked a little bit about the gamification of culture, but what do you make of the I guess the oft reviled gamer culture? Is this actually a thing? And if it is it sort of necessarily politically reactionary, as some analyses of, I guess, the alt-right or American gamer culture seem to suggest or presuppose?
I don't think it's a thing. I mean, I think it's partially a thing, but it doesn't make sense to me to speak of gamer culture when it's this vast field. And you've got all sorts of people playing games, and also all sorts of people interacting with each other about games. Like there's so many niches and so many different types of things. And of course, people are talking about the most obvious, the youngest, most vocal players who are, of course, many times reactionary because they live in a reactionary culture. But I don't think there's anything inherently reactionary about it. And I think there's games were one of the first places where this sort of idpol ping pong of doom between the everybody's a fascist and we are actually defending your blah blah blah, kind of the two poles started. So you've got the people who the very cynical people who write these articles about how all gamers are terrible. And then you have the also very cynical people who come in and like, we will defend games from the intrusion of the social justice warriors, and this is incredibly cynical on all sides, because there are many real problems and many real issues, but you've just basically got these two people who keep escalating this conversation as if it was the most important thing in the world, and most normal people in games are just sick of it or uninterested, or so I think a lot of those essays about how the alt-right came from games or whatever, it's nonsense. It's just really tired nonsense. But it's very easy for this to work because somebody comes in and they say, everybody who plays games is a reactionary. Then you get angry. You're not politically educated. You live in the world we live in now, where you're never exposed to any different ideas, and then you think, oh shit, this is offensive. I hate this person. Then somebody else comes in and says, I will defend you, and it's some far right twat who doesn't give a shit about games, has probably never played a game in his life. But then you think, this person is defending me and my culture. And of course, there the problem comes in that you start having forms of identity politics. And I think this whole, I'm a gamer, I must defend gaming, is just another form of identity politics, just a sort of a more right-wing one.
So maybe just to kind of wrap up on some of these questions on gaming, art, politics, philosophy, before moving on to Greek politics. I think there's a brand of socialism. It's perhaps particularly almost puritanically British, that sees games, including football and drugs of all sorts, as a distraction from the true task of politics, true task of making socialism. And you can see many examples of this. Terry Eagleton's anti-footballism is an example that comes to my mind. I mean, as socialists, or what? I don't want to kind of ask a trite question about what's the correct socialist position on games, but do socialists have a problem with having fun?
well, not to go all, Emma Goldman on this, but like, what the fuck are we actually trying to achieve socialism for if it's not having fun at the end of it, being free to do the things that we like to do? So is there a very reactionary brand of something that calls itself left-wing or socialist? I think so, yes. It makes no sense to me as a Marxist. It's completely alien to me. For one thing, the point I keep trying to make is that, well, it's not politics. I mean, like, one thing that I once wrote that I was fairly proud of is I wrote a little post that said art is not politics. Art can be political thematically, but it's not politics. You're not doing something political when you're engaging with art, nor should we delude ourselves as artists that what we do has a political effect. It can have an intellectual effect on people. It's very interesting. It's very powerful, transcendent, whatever, but it's not actually doing politics. And to me, that division makes sense. So it's absurd for somebody who wants to organize the working class to even have a position on this. Because it's not political. It's, even to say, oh no, games are good, games are bad, is just culture war bullshit. And but there's certainly a huge sort of puritanical chunk of the left that sees whatever is good or fun in human life as bad, for whatever reason. They usually come up. I mean, you see it right now. It's everywhere. It's. I think what we call the left right now is even its idea of fun is not fun. Is kind of bureaucratic. So
organized fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe to move on to the left, and one of the key sort of sites of struggle of the European left, at least in Greece, because we also wanted to talk a little bit about Greek politics, and so you sometimes comment online about this. And could you tell us a little bit about your background here and how it relates to politics in Greece?
Well, I grew up in Greece. I'm half Greek. Despite I have another bizarre accent to add to your collection of weird accents on your show, but I grew up here, and I left at some point, obviously, to go study and work, as a lot of people do here, in Germany. Actually, sorry, I was in Germany when the crisis hit, but of course I come back a lot. I spend a lot of time here, and I just experienced this as a Greek person, as a Greek leftist. I just, as an ordinary Greek leftist, I just experienced this entire thing, and the effect it had on my family, on people here, and on politics here. So I have no other special connection. I've never really, I'm not part of any parties or things. I'm just a Greek person who had to experience this.
So one of the big questions for the Greek left, and it's a theme we've visited a few times, but I think is still a lesson that's percolating on the European left, is thinking about what the failures of the Greek left, essentially, when the stakes were so high and so dramatic, as you indicate in what you just said about your own personal experience and your family's experience of the financial crisis in Greece. What's your explanation for the failure of Syriza? And why is it important that we read these events correctly, do you think? Because I know that there's a tendency on the left to quickly brush to one side, attempts to make sure that the explanation is specific and precise with what happened with Syriza. So what's your take on it?
Okay, so my take. Okay, I'll give you a personal lens just for a second there. So, my hope, and the hope of every leftist I knew, was not that Syriza would cause some kind of massive change in Greek society, or that they would even do all of the things that they said they would do. I know so many people who said if they just did 10%, if things just got a little bit better, because they had been getting dramatically worse under government after government, after EU imposed non-elected government, and that was all that our ambition was, right? And I remember thinking, okay, so from my analytical perspective as a Marxist, a social democratic government serves capital. And in times of prosperity, it will redistribute a certain amount of money towards the poor and support the working class in some minor ways in order to uphold the rule of capital. But in a time of crisis, the social democratic government will serve capital, and that will mean imposing austerity and so on and so forth. This seemed like the correct analysis. I didn't want to believe that. I thought, okay, but that's too reductionist. That's just too mechanical. That's in the real world. Syriza has this long history, and all these people who have been protesting in the street for 30 years, and there's this individual and that individual, and I was wrong. Because it does work that way, and the Marxist analysis, as simplistic as it is correct. And what happened was not a betrayal, except in the sense of a betrayal of the democratic mandate. It was simply a social democratic government doing what all social democratic governments in European history have done, which is serve capital. And they just turned around and they served capital. And they became the most right-wing government we had had up until that point, not because they were inherently right-wing, but because capital required right-wing policies, and they were the stewards of capital or of the system during that time. And there is no difference between them and the government before them. There's perfect continuity. And that became apparent pretty much immediately, and we all lied to ourselves. It's almost a shame Bernie Sanders didn't win, because then we could have observed the exact same process of, oh, I wonder why he's doing that. No, I'm sure it's a strategic thing. He's actually trying to play them, and it's going to be something. And then, that wasn't a very good choice, but they're under pressure. There's probably an explanation, and oh, this is actually bad. And then at some point, oh, they've completely fucked us. But yeah, we just deluded ourselves into thinking that a social democratic government would be any different than the SPD or Die Linke or Labour or any of that lot. And frankly, even before they got elected, they had absorbed a huge part of PASOK, and that should have been, pretty clear. I have a friend, he's still alive, who was sort of much more, his family was sort of much more involved with the party, and he told me, we don't recognize this party anymore because, even before, in my opinion, this was, before Syriza blew up, it was a very academic, petit bourgeois kind of party. It was not a workers' party. It never was. That space is occupied by the Greek, Communist Party, which is sort of Stalinist dinosaur party. But it was never a working class party, and but at that point, even the sort of more committed academic leftists were being driven out by the sort of PASOK people, and anybody in the party from the first moment, anybody in the party from the first moment they got into power, anybody who was kind of inconveniently left wing or had plans to do something they didn't like or whatever, just got put into useless positions or whatever. Like, it was very actually clear when you look back at it that this just was the strategy from the get-go. There was never going to be a confrontation with capital. And ironically, I think the only person who believed that there was going to be something is Varoufakis, who is this very strange man who is a capitalist. Well, okay, so I think Varoufakis is an honorable idiot. Like, he believes what he says, right? I think he genuinely does. Because he's also taken positions that are not convenient to take, like defending Julian Assange, which is one of these things where everyone on the left is, oh no, we can't do that. And he's actually done that, which is very honorable. So I think he believes in what he does. Why he thinks that he's some sort of erratic Marxist is beyond me. He's clearly a capitalist. But he is a capitalist who had some sort of cohesive plan and actually believed that they could improve things in a completely capitalist way. But still, that would have been better for Greece, possibly. But of course, his entire understanding of what situation he was in was completely delusional. He didn't understand anything, and I'm not sure he's fully understood now either. Yeah. But nevertheless, what he's written about it, I think, matches sort of what we saw from the outside quite well, which is that there really was never a true dedication to any kind of left-wing policy, except the typical left-wing thing of managing the affairs of capital in a slightly more humane way than the other side would, which is the difference is very slight if it exists.
So when you mentioned the 10% of what would have been enough, what would that 10% have been? From an external perspective on the Greek crisis at the time, what struck me that was interesting was so many people I know who would subsequently support Remain in the 2016 referendum here in the UK were very supportive of a no vote, ohi, in the Greek referendum of 2015. So when Syriza had this referendum, which it seemed they expected to lose, on whether or not to accept the EU austerity package, and then they won the referendum. The Greek people rejected the austerity package, but the government accepted it anyway. And what I suppose, to my mind, the only 10% that I wanted from Syriza was, that I didn't expect it, but the only thing that I thought would have potentially vindicated them was a willingness to walk away from the Eurozone and the European Union, with all the difficulties that would have entailed. But that seems to me, I didn't expect them to establish socialism in Greece or anything like that. Simply what they could have done for the Greek people at the minimum was to observe the democratic mandate, like you say. So that was my kind of 10%, but I was curious to know what your 10% was that you hoped for, at least a minimal program.
Honestly, anything. Like, people were so desperate and just taking a stand on something. They kept announcing, oh, we have a red line on this. We're not going to go further than this. We're not going to go further than that. And they went, of course, further on everything. But defending, I don't know, something, anything, people's income, people's not getting kicked out of their homes, people just literally anything. If they had just not agreed to something, some cut, some maybe privatizing all of our airports and selling them to Fraport, so that now that bizarre arrangement they have where Greece basically pays for these airports, pays for upgrades, pays right now. The German airport company that's partially owned by the state, if I'm not mistaken, is demanding money from Greece because they're not making any money because of coronavirus. So that's the arrangement we have, a completely colonial arrangement. And any of these things, but they didn't resist on anything. Yeah. For God's sake, even once they signed, we could have at least expected them to say not support horrific police violence against everyone, or to do something about Golden Dawn, the fascist organization. And I'm pretty much a free speech fanatic, but Golden Dawn is not it's not a free speech issue because that's a criminal organization that literally stabbed people in the open. That's a paramilitary terror organization that needed to be stamped out. And they did shit about that. And now these people their buddies are back in power now. And they're all going to get away with murder, literally. So they did absolutely nothing. And they were more vicious than the right-wing governments before them. And all we wanted is for this non-stop austerity to maybe slow down a little bit instead of accelerate. But they couldn't do that. They did nothing. I don't think people understand this. I see discussions with European or American leftists, in inverted commas, about this, where they're like, well, they tried and they didn't really. No, you don't understand. This was the most right-wing government we've ever had. Yeah, it was insane. It was hilarious because they would announce that they're opposing police violence while literally sending the police to beat people up at the same time. But it was an awful, incredibly right-wing government. And of course, the referendum thing is a whole separate discussion, because that really can only be described as a betrayal. That is treason, what they did. I mean, it's literally treason because it's unconstitutional. They had the obligation to do what the people told them to do, which is no.
Yeah.
And that was, and just the fact that we can ignore that anybody who calls themselves a leftist can ignore such a massive anti-democratic action, to me says anybody who does it is not a leftist. You're not on the left. You're not a supporter of democracy. You're some kind of parody, because that's just not in. That's fundamentally not acceptable. That if the people vote something, you do the opposite. In that case, you are the enemy of the people. The end.
Especially when sorry, just to jump in, because I think it's interesting in terms of in relation to kind of making excuses along the lines of what you're hinting at. That basically, yes, they had this referendum, but and you use the term, you yourself as a Marxist, you see things in a certain way. The Social Democrats are always going to behave in a certain way and act in the interest of capital in the final analysis. And yet a lot of the kind of supposedly Marxist left, their interpretation of what happened in Greece was an exercise often, I think, what I would see as sort of excuse making. That, yes, but, as serious Marxists, as serious materialists, we have to look at the structural conditions, and that Greece leaving the Eurozone would have been led to complete devastation, would have been awful, etc. And anyway, would still have been capitalism. So how can you justify that? And therefore, Syriza probably did the intelligent thing in not seeing through the referendum. And I think, there's two separate questions here. One is the question of democratic betrayal, which I entirely agree with you. But then I think that argument often ends up in a situation which where you try to put it, I say the people who are making excuses try to put that question aside and go, yes, but, ignoring that for a second, leaving the Eurozone would have been devastation. So, what do you think of that? I guess to kind of place to make a sort of devil's advocate argument, that wouldn't have been, leaving the Eurozone wouldn't have been socialism, and it would have led to economic devastation, and you definitely wouldn't have gotten your 10% there.
Okay, so wait, what are the two parts of the question?
Sorry about that. I was a bit rambly. No, I think I totally, leaving to one side the question of the democratic legitimacy of the referendum and the obligation that imposed on the Syriza government of following that through. Putting that to one side, the question of leaving the Eurozone, whether that there you don't even get your 10%.
Well, okay. So first of all, I can't really leave aside the democratic question, because it kind of is really important to this, because it doesn't matter if we're going to get socialism from it. You're not going to get a socialism if you first start by ignoring the people. Yeah. So that's completely essential. Like, those people keep putting it aside, but it cannot be put aside because it's the foundation of the entire goddamn concept of, a workers' movement to liberate humanity and the working class. You can't. What are we aiming at? China? Stalinism? No, we're aiming at genuine socialism. If we are, then democracy is not an optional little thing that may when it's convenient. But if the people are wrong, that's not an option. So in this particular case, that's just it's non-negotiable that you could never go anywhere by rejecting that. Like, the moment you reject the results of the referendum, you've already made any possibility of any socialist movement or anything even resembling socialism already completely impossible. Now, actually leaving the Eurozone, this is complicated because, first of all, the idea that leaving the Eurozone would have been economically devastating is absurd, because we were already fucking devastated. Mm-hmm. Like, the country was just in ruins. I mean, it already was economically. So that's one of the most laughable things. Is like, what would they have done to us? Like, what that they hadn't already done, like, or that didn't happen anyway. It's always like Syriza was always like, oh, we're going to do some countermeasures to it, so it's not going to be bullshit, absolute bullshit. Nothing. It's exactly the same thing. So I mean, the worst case scenario already happened. It was Syriza. It was staying. So things would not have gotten any worse economically. And there are some arguments that things might have gotten a little bit better. It's not socialism, nor do I believe in some sort of nationalist solution. Like long-term, Greece, even a revolutionary Greece, could obviously not hold out. Socialism in one country is not possible. It would always have needed the support of the European working class. But in order to get there, we have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And opposing the EU in that situation was absolutely necessary. Now, where that would have led, that's a very, very complicated question, how that could have played. But the significant thing is that an unbelievable majority of the Greek population, including conservatives, including people on the far right, voted no, in a situation where the propaganda was non-stop. Like in Greece, the media are owned by like 5 guys, and they're all on the far right, and like they're all, which in Greece means they're pro-EU, as in many places except Britain, where everybody thinks that being pro-EU is some sort of left-wing position. So they're all the state media, all these the oligarchs that you keep hearing about, they're all pro-EU. And so it was wall-to-wall propaganda, really, really extreme propaganda from the moment Syriza got elected, but especially there, that we're going to be turned into Syria or Libya. It's going to be civil war. We're going to die. The supermarkets are all empty. They weren't empty. I was here during that. All of that, also what was shown in the media worldwide was just completely made up. So under those conditions, and also with EU politicians openly threatening the Greek people that they would be punished, completely openly, just not even pretending that a democratic referendum is something you shouldn't meddle in. Under those conditions, a vast amount of people voted no. Now, that's not socialism, but if you're a left-wing movement, a genuine socialist movement, you could not be in a better position. You had more support there than anybody in Greek politics has had in the history of Greek politics going back 2,500 years. The last time this many people agreed, it was about not letting the Persians take over. And still, they betrayed it. So the magnitude of that, the apathy that has led to, is unbelievable. Because everybody was ready, and where it would have led, I don't know. It would have led to a confrontation. Would we have lost the confrontation? Maybe, or maybe some sort of better compromise would have been reached, and then there would be more struggles ahead. Or I'm not particularly utopian about this. I don't think that it would have immediately solved every problem, but if there was a chance to make a beginning against austerity in Europe, it was that. That was the moment. Because the support was there in a way it's not been there for anything else. And being social democrats, they wasted it.
I think that's very, very well put. A lot to agree with in that. And maybe just as a final sort of shorter question, because I don't think none of us have a crystal ball here to predict this. But given the apathy and given the state of the Greek left at the moment, what could come next in this movement? Do you have any optimism for new struggles, or is the Greek left going to be living in the sort of shadow of Syriza for a while to come?
Well, I am optimistic in the sense that I have maybe a slightly religious-like faith in humankind. But on a day-to-day basis, I don't have a huge amount of hope. I think right now we have recreated the PASOK Nea Demokratia two-party state that we used to have, with Syriza just taking the place of PASOK and being the same thing. And it'll, alternate between them, and nothing will happen. They'll all have the same politics. And whatever is now left-wing, Syriza used to be like, I don't know, 3-4 whatever % party, maybe a bit more, I don't know. There used to be a tiny party. So that whatever segment has either splintered into various idiotic parties, or a lot of it, I think, is being captured by sort of imported American, quasi-anarchist identity politics. I think in Greece, this stuff had never caught on previously, but I think now it's gonna catch on, and we're gonna lose ourselves in culture wars, and it works, I think, fairly well because Greece is a very conservative country. The church is very powerful. There's definitely some racism here and there, though it's, of course, not even remotely the racism of America, and it makes absolutely no sense to import all these categories and start calling people white and whatever, all this absurd, sort of cultural imperialist nonsense that keeps happening. But I think that's where it's going to go, because it's young people and they see their politics, they get their politics off the internet, and that means America. And this is politics of powerlessness. This is what you do when nothing's really happening, and you want to pretend that you're doing something. You get angry about cultural stuff while they're literally ripping off every piece of property that you have, every last euro that you have. And I'm afraid that the sort of protest left, which is anyway in Greece, I think, far too in love with symbolic actions, is going to be tending towards, various performative anarchist things that do nothing. Now, of course, the material conditions are going to keep getting worse, and coronavirus has had a huge impact that is not yet felt. Not because it killed a lot of people, so far it hasn't, but of course now we've, everybody, all the tourists are going to come here, and they're going to bring every single sort of form. I mean, okay, there's not that many various forms of coronavirus yet, but we're going to get all of them anyway. Like we're going to get coronavirus from every country. I don't know what the impact of that will be. We'll see, but because obviously the healthcare system is a disaster. But even without the coronavirus, like the specific the fact that it kills people, the impact on the tourist industry is just devastating, because that's the last industry that's still standing in this country. So things are going to get even worse. But unfortunately, things can keep getting worse without anything really happening. So where's the beginning of a workers' movement that can actually do something? I don't know. I have no hope for the Communist Party. There's like 5 or 6 good people in that party, sort of at the lower ranks, but as a party, it's just a party of dinosaurs that are more interested really in backstabbing each other or complaining about this committee or that committee than doing anything. The rest of the left is just shattered. So if something, my hope, of course, is always that at some point something will come from the actual working class, not from academics, not from anarchists, or the children of sort of impoverished middle class families, but actually from the working class. But I'm very afraid that that will be captured by the right. Because if we go towards the whole culture war thing, then they can very easily just appeal to family tradition and just the normal everyday experience of Greek people. And if they then offer a little bit of an economic incentive, it's then do I choose the neoliberal who tells me that I'm a horrible, racist, misogynist pig, or do I choose the guy who says it's good to be Greek and we're going to give you a little bit of money?
No, I think that picture, as you paint it, has a lot of similarities with the situation facing the left across Europe, and probably more widely as well. But I think that's not the most optimistic, but I think a great place to leave it. Just to say, thanks so much for an extremely interesting and wide-ranging discussion, Jonas.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I didn't say anything more interesting about games. I feel that I think that I tend to always try to make games less special. Everybody always tries to impose some sort of, like games are unique because it's like, and most things are sort of exist in the same, whether it's Greek politics or games. It all exists in the same sort of horrible capitalist chaos where there are some good things and a lot of awful things, and none of it has the answer or the solution. None of it is that special or will somehow give us this one insight that we need.
I heard you saying, Stalinist. Every time you said Stalinist dinosaur, I thought of an actual Stalinist dinosaur. And I thought, you could have a game showing kind of the evolution of the left through the, you have a Stalinist dinosaur, and then you have like a Trotsky Rex, and then you could have a ball. I don't know, just an idea.
I did once want to make a game about. I started making a game about. Was it like communist space cats or something?
Oh,
and you played Leon Trotsky.
I mean, this is the game that is going to get Alex into gaming.
My cat's name is Sputnichka, so that's right up my street.
Okay, well,
that was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I should have been more decisive, saying that's a wrap, but I didn't.
It's a wrap. It was a wrap.
It's wrapped. It's been wrapped.